and those are the very basic fundamental human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to participate in a democracy, the right not to be detained unlawfully, the right to a fair trial, and such like, including the right to life and the right to family life. And we are, as a select committee, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, we are looking at the issue of whether there is equal protection for the rights of Black people compared to non-Black people. And this is the second session we have had on that issue, and we will be reporting on the basis of this inquiry in the autumn. And in this session, we have got two panels, and we're very grateful indeed to our witnesses who have come to give evidence. The second panel will be the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and we're grateful to have the chair and the chief executive who will be hearing as the second panel. And our first panel, we're very grateful to Professor Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent, who is the chief midwifery officer of the NHS. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, we know that there's been a very welcome reduction in mortality of women from complications in pregnancy over the last decade or so. But within that, there are significant variations based on race, so that whilst 7 in 100,000 white women die of pregnancy complications or childbirth, that's 7 out of 100 right to family life. And we're very grateful indeed to you for joining us, Professor Dunkley-Bent. And I'd be grateful if you could deal with the first question, which is, why is this the case? And also, when was it first established beyond doubt that there was this racial disparity in deaths amongst Black and non-Black women during pregnancy and childbirth?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any maternal death is an absolute tragedy, and I'm more than the same as others who work in maternity care, who have supported and delivered hundreds of babies throughout my career. Still find this unpalatable. So these data sometimes obscure the human experience. This is a precious life, and that's why we are in this space at NHS England, myself and colleagues, to try and reduce the mortality and morbidity of Black, Asian and women who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So we take our lead from the Embrace data, Mother and Baby Reducing Risk Through Audit and Confidential Inquiry report. And that report has indicated to us that there is an inequity in health outcome for Black mothers, Asian mothers and the socioeconomically disadvantaged. So reasons why, there are plausible explanations as to why this may be the case. And when I think about the data in regards to Black women, Black African women, there are 2% of white women, and that then creates a challenge during pregnancy. Equally, heart disease and other such conditions that may well be more likely to occurring in certain communities like Black, British, Black African communities. If I stepped into the Asian women's space, we know that if you are Pakistani, for example, you are more likely to experience neonatal mortality, and that's because some of the explanations relate to close relative marriage, and therefore you're more likely to have a baby who has a congenital abnormality and therefore less likely to have a good outcome. However, with all those examples, and there is something more that we need to do to ensure that we close this gap. We need to be timely with our intervention. We need to be responsive to the services or the needs of women in their families. And that's why we have Better Births, the report of the National Maternity Review. We're 4 years into a 5-year programme, and we have the NHS long-term plan. And both those policy documents lend themselves to focusing on socioeconomically disadvantaged, but in this space, Black women in particular. Just as an example, if I may, we are asking for a model of care called continuity of carer that will improve outcomes for mums and babies. So we know that continuity of carer is care that to lose your pregnancy, you're more likely to have an improved maternal experience throughout the pregnancy. So those data have informed our policy, and that's why 75% of women from a Black British, Black African, Black Caribbean background will receive continuity of carer. That's one of our policy ambitions.
And thank you for that. And of course, the situation is, like with everything, made more pronounced with COVID. And I was seeing that the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists have disparity, which is like a multiplier in this situation.
Yes, COVID has shone a light on inequality. And whilst we had information before that in relation to inequality in health outcome, COVID has shone a light on this situation. We know that if you're of an Asian background, you're 4 times more likely to, and intensity is provided communication out to women in their families through our local maternity systems, our heads directors of midwifery, any of our health professionals that are engaging with pregnant mums. We've used social media platforms and websites. We have developed so that we are responsive to these concerns. We have developed animation 19. So with that anecdotal evidence and with the UCOS data that you cited, that means that Black Asian minority women are disproportionately in hospital in comparison to their white counterparts. Our anecdotal evidence tells us that women are fearful, so they're more likely to sit at home with a problem that in a world outside of COVID would have taken them into hospital and received timely care. So as the evidence emerges, we're learning more about why is it that this group are affected. It's similar to the rest of the population, but in the maternity space, what can we do at this time? So we have reached out to women in their families to reduce their anxiety, reduce their fears, reduce their concerns through those mediums that I mentioned previously, to encourage them to engage with us early. And only in the last week or so, we have published a 4-point plan. So myself and Matthew Jolly, he's a consultant obstetrician and the national clinical director. The two of us work hand in hand as midwife and doctor to support our maternity providers. And we published a week or so ago a 4-point plan out to screening, diagnostics, all the things that one would do, but heightening a sense of a full lot of surveillance that they can understand in a language they can understand. They need to see people that look like them giving the message, and their antennae may well be raised to hearing that message and then acting on that communication message.
So with over half of the pregnant women who are admitted to hospital with coronavirus being Black or Asian or minority ethnic background, if you add that to the 5 times greater likelihood of Black women to die in pregnancy or in childbirth, are you expecting then that the racial disparity between white women and non-white women is going to be even worse than the
Black mums and Black babies too? The maternal death rate is reducing, and it isn't maternal death. I don't want to scare people. Maternal death isn't as common as the data may sound. 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy. That's a real statistic. In real terms, this may equate to, out of the 660,000 births that we have in England every year, that may equate to some 70 women. Now, one maternal death is tragic, and I'm not trying to suggest that it isn't. Of course, it's absolutely tragic. But what we are doing with our interventions, our communications, our working with women, our Maternity Voices partnership, our users isn't increasing, is heard, is on point, and is
about a 4-point plan that's been recently published. Did we cover
ensure that we record ethnicity in an appropriate way and record the comorbidities? So some of the pre-existing conditions that women experience outside of pregnancy, that is really important, because if we have those data, we can have good surveillance, and then we can sharpen our focus on ensuring that women get the most appropriate care. So
that's point 4. I'm just looking at the written evidence that the Royal College of Midwives have provided us with for this committee session. I think there's also a 3rd point: ensuring hospitals discuss vitamin supplements and nutrition in pregnancy with all women. Yeah. Now, this 4-point plan, it's just recently been published, like within the last couple of weeks, or more recently than that. And how does it relate to the NHS long-term plan, which you told us had established a principle of continuity of carer throughout pregnancy and beyond?
Yes, so the 4-point plan is really, and apologies I didn't mention vitamin D, our 4-point plan specifically talks about nutritional requirements and vitamin D, particularly for women who cover up when they're out in daylight, or indeed dark-skinned women like myself, for example. But the similarities with the long-term action as a part of their action plan for implementation.
And so how does the 4-point plan fit into the NHS long-term plan?
So with regards to continuity of carer, every midwife that carries a caseload of women and provides antenatal, labour and postnatal care, they will be having the good outcomes of continuity of care are predicated on relational continuity. It's a relationship that builds up. So a woman is more likely to listen to a person that she knows and trusts. So therefore, in the antenatal period, when you're discussing vitamin D, for example, you would naturally discuss that focus, personalised care for that woman. If the woman was from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, vitamin D would sit within that conversation. For example, communication. So the leaflets that I talked about in the 4-point plan, they're in different languages. They cover pregnancy, the sick baby, the sick mum. So that would be very much focused in a personalised way for the continuity midwife to select the appropriate leaflet for that woman, for example.
And just
ethnic coding. Yeah.
And just focusing on the long-term plan at the moment, other than the continuity of care plan, did it include any other suggestions for improving the data that we're discussing?
In the long-term plan?
Yeah.
So the long-term plan, we have a universal offer. We're utilising the principles of Michael Marmot, which is proportionate universalism, where you have care at scale and intensity that is equal to the level of disadvantage. So in the long-term plan entry, continuity of care is one. Those that need it most, we need to have our model of care applied to those women, because continuity of care improves outcomes and reduces preterm birth. And if you're Black, African, Caribbean, Asian, you are more likely to experience a very preterm birth baby. Other things that we're doing in the long-term plan that sit in this space is a universal offer. We have the Saving Babies' Lives Care Bundle, and that includes 4 elements. It's a toolkit. It includes 4 elements in Saving Babies' Lives Care Bundle 1 that would help to improve outcomes. Because of evaluation, we have now included, and a government target to reduce preterm birth, we have now included a 5th element, and that 5th element is targeted at reducing preterm birth. So in the long-term plan, the Saving Babies' Lives Care Bundle firmly sits in the space of a targeted effort. Whilst it's a universal offer, Black, Asian, minority ethnic women will benefit from an area where they're considered to be more likely at risk. And then we have 2 other items in the long-term plan for maternity, and that is to do with pelvic outreach clinics. So pelvic floor integrity, wanting all women who may experience leaking before or after childbirth to have timely intervention so that they can have quality of life moving forward. And that affects all women, but what the evidence tells us is that certain women are less likely to disclose some of these concerns and challenges. We know that, for example, Black women and immigrant women are less likely to disclose concerns around anxiety and depression, and think we've considered this, and then essentially go back to the day job, as it were. So in answer to your question, I think every little helps. I think it's good, but I do question what true levers it actually has to affect the change that we need right now.
And with that in mind, may I just very briefly ask, what sort of levers do you think would be needed? So we heard earlier about perhaps a lack of data. We've heard about wider context and wider issues. I'd just be interested in very briefly your thoughts on what levers would be needed to be able to ensure that we do have true equality in the system on this.
Yeah, I think what I was thinking about was accountability levels. How does one become accountable? We have the moral challenge, but true accountability may well be hidden in huge work programs. I think that for us to truly embrace the inequality in health outcome, there is something about unconscious bias that needs to be embraced. I think there's something about how we engage with people and truly listen, or do we hear what we want to hear? And having those who use maternity services, childbearing women, telling us from the Black community, telling us this is what I didn't like, this is what I did like, this is what I didn't like, but I think I should have more of, so that we can sharpen our focus. And that's why earlier I mentioned the Maternity Voices Partnership and the new and emerging Black, Asian, minority ethnic Maternity Voices Partnership, to help us to not only just think about this morally, but actually create some action that is felt in the home or at the bedside or wherever we're providing maternity care. That was the kind of lever. But accountability, I think, is key for me.
And if I may, Chair, just very briefly, just on that though, would you say that to date, the data that's collected and the voices, as it were, what people are saying and the stories they're sharing and the concerns they've got, has that historically been in place? I suppose what I'm getting at is, do you think moving forward we should have a better data collection on those voices to enable accountability to be made, but also to make sure that those accountable are getting the right information?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Doreen.
Thank you, Chair. You've met me already, so I'll plunge straight into asking you your opinion on something, please. Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement gives an opportunity for us to re-examine public services, including health services, and to confront racial equality and unequal protection of human rights for Black people that we know is so persistent in this country? What could be done about that? Or is it all being done already?
I think it's an interesting question. Black Lives Matter have shone a light on inequality. We all, I guess, as human beings, step into our own sphere of influence. I look at maternity, but I think thinking more widely, we are now talking about race. We're talking about inequality at every level, be that in a supermarket or indeed in the highest parts of government. We are having that conversation, shining a light on the issue, the disparity in health outcomes. This committee, for example, is enabling that conversation. But what I'm fearful of is the conversation becomes the conversation. And I'm keen that we are supported to have key actions that will really help us to get to the answer. It's not just about the NHS, it's about social care, it's about housing, it's about poverty, inequality, not having an equal start. And what I'm always minded of is the fact that the foundations for health and well-being very much start in childhood. In fact, they start in the womb. So, huge responsibility to support preconception and pregnant mums going forward, because we know that the environment in the womb can influence socioeconomic disadvantage, heart disease, mental health. We have the evidence that tells us that. And that's why I'm really pleased that with the Black Lives Matter movement, the conversation is very palpable at all levels.
So for you, what would be the main levers that you would want to put into place to help things move forward?
Generally, for the NHS, for maternity,
yes.
For the
disparity, the racial disparity. That's what we're looking at. I mean, obviously, the Health Committee looks at maternity services more generally. We're looking at the racial disparity in the context of the human rights.
Yes. So what I would like is that we have set a target. So I was asked a question before about target for reducing that inequity in health outcome. We have set a target in the long-term plan for 75% of Black, Asian, minority ethnic women to receive continuity of care. We set that target because that model of care improves outcomes. The other 25%, what the evidence tells us is some women don't want continuity of care or are at high risk and therefore have to have continuity through a medical obstetric model. So we have a target, and I would like to see that target implemented. So we have in the long-term plan set that, and we're working in the COVID space to look at how we can ensure that we implement that in a timely way. But for that 75% of women to receive continuity, 75% of Black, Asian, minority ethnic women to receive continuity of care, we have to look at the workforce in terms of numbers, capacity, buildings, non-buildings, resource, etc. And that's what we're working through now.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just follow up with one final question, if I may? You've mentioned a target for an element of the care of Black women being continuity of care. But in the NHS, I think we've all come to understand it, that when the NHS thinks something's important, a target is set to achieve it. And obviously, the achievement that we're talking about is reducing the racial disparity between Black mothers dying in pregnancy and childbirth compared to non-Black mothers dying in pregnancy and childbirth. Do you think it's surprising that there isn't a target to reduce that really glaring racial disparity? And do you think there should be a target to reduce that glaring racial disparity?
The short answer, absolutely yes, absolutely. One death where there's inequality because you're not on a level playing field is one death too many. But I go back to the target that we've set for that provision of care. That provision of care is not just about one appointment. That is about a whole relationship for 9 months. We know that women are more likely to disclose domestic violence, substance misuse. That relationship, the evidence tells us that if you have this model of care, you improve outcomes for mums and babies, and that's why we've set that target for that group of women.
Well, thank you very much for your evidence to us today, Professor Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent. Thank you very much indeed. Could I now turn to our next panel who are giving evidence to us, and that is the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, David Isaac, and also the Chief Executive, Rebecca Hilsenrath. Can I welcome you to giving evidence to the committee today and ask Karen Buck to pose the first question?
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to David and Rebecca. I just wanted to ask you as an introductory question to your approach to this, whether the reaction to the killing of George Floyd in this country, the campaigning that has been unleashed around Black Lives Matter surprised you, and if so, why and how?
Can I just start by saying I'm going to start off and then introduce Rebecca as we go along, so that we have continuity of speaking and we're not interrupting each other. So thank you for the question. In answer to whether or not I was surprised, yes, surprised and disappointed. I think we at the Commission and those of us who've been working in relation to inequality issues over many decades know that Black Lives Matter has existed for some time, but George Floyd's death did actually throw things into sharp focus, together with the discussion and the disparities that we've just been hearing about that the Commission has long identified, but particularly drawn into sharp focus because of COVID-19. So I think for me, what's happened is that the conversation has been widened to not just those who are directly impacted and those who are allies, but those out in the wider society who I think have realised now more than ever that we're all connected to each other. And I think COVID and George Floyd's death actually has brought about a real opportunity to move the discussion forward, to talk about real actions. And Professor Dunkley-Bent was talking about this earlier, to secure the data, to secure action, and to stop talking about it. This is our moment, I believe.
It is, but I mean, the reason for kind of asking the question is really one of the things that I think people have got most distressed about has been the fact that there has been review after review after review after review. That in work that you have done in the past, there's obviously been the Lamy Review, there's been the Inequalities report that Theresa May commissioned, none of which has been acted on. And given your central role in all of this, does that not in some ways suggest that perhaps your organisation hasn't been driving this forward as much as it should have been?
Well, I don't agree that we as an organisation haven't been doing what we by statute are required to do. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca in a second, but I'm on the record as saying that it is very disappointing that the government hasn't actually acted on the various recommendations that have been made. In 2017, we actually produced the most extensive review into the inequality of race outcomes and suggested to government that there should be a coherent race strategy. I mean, we are not in government. We are obviously an NHRI and an Equality and Human Rights body. Where
yes, and I'm very clear that I'm not blaming you for the substance of government, of course. Absolutely.
Yes, and so we work hard to lobby and influence government, to hold them to account and use the powers. And I'd quite like to talk to you about the various things that we have been able to do in this space, because we, like others, are anxious that we do make progress and stop talking about the issues, because now, as I said earlier, is the time actually to move the dial. But Rebecca, can I hand over?
Could I just ask, yes, as you hand on to Rebecca, to just talk us through the specific actions that you have taken or flagged with government, particularly since the 2017 report that you did?
Sorry, you broke up a little then. So you'd like me to...
I was just asking you or Rebecca, talk through the actions that have been taken since you made those recommendations to government. Okay.
Well, Rebecca, shall I hand over to you?
Very happily, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I think just coming back specifically on the question which we entirely agree and endorse with, that there have been a large number of reviews and recommendations which have sadly not seen action. We would like to reply separately, and I will, David and I both will, in terms of other things that the Commission has done over those years. But I think specifically on that point, as you say, there's been a number of reviews. There's been Lamy on criminal justice, Angeloni on deaths in custody, McGregor-Smith on race in the workplace, Williams on Windrush. As David said, we produced a roadmap to race equality 4 years ago, which was very clear about the need for a joined-up strategy across government, across the areas of health, housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. We have repeatedly, at every opportunity, called for that roadmap to be implemented and acted on. Because we believe that there's a need for a long-term coordinated strategy in order for there to be made a difference. The race disparity audit that was set up as a result of that roadmap is something that has adapted our measurement framework, has worked closely with us, and we think it's done a very good job on data gathering. But again, we've asked for action. We've played quite a vital role in relation to scrutinising the government's implementation of those reviews. And while it hasn't led to action, we were part of the HMPPS expert panel on challenging progress against Lamy recommendations. We worked with governments to push for the Williams review on Windrush, and we're now obviously undertaking our own Section 31 assessment in relation to that. We advised Parliament throughout. We gave evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee on Angelini. We've repeatedly called for implementation of McGregor-Smith on work, because work is a big focus, for us. And the truth of the matter is, we think we have a good dialogue with government often. And an example is on Parva spray, where we've achieved a really good conversation with MOJ. We've set out our concerns, and we believe that they understand our worries about rolling it out without proper safeguards. But nevertheless, these things have gone forward. And ultimately, as you kindly said, we're not the government. We've done our absolute best to get it to that stage. We also, I think perhaps important to say, one of our roles as the NHRI is to produce shadow reports against the government's performance against 𝐒𝐻D. That's been delayed this year because of COVID. We've been pushing the government to set a date for their report so that we can follow up with the shadow report. And we've been pushing them also to resource it properly and to engage with civil society. So we can do all that up to the brink of the government actually implementing the recommendations. But that's where our powers stop.
Actually gone backwards in some ways. What is your analysis as to why that's happened?
Rebecca, do you want to lead on that?
Well, I suppose, the immediate and obvious answer is, without wishing to sound too sort of self-reflective, the point I've just made. The issues that I think lie at the heart of racial disparities in this country are very, very interconnected. It's why our roadmap draws across those 5 key areas: health, housing, education, employment, criminal justice. We do not think that actually until...
That strikes me as being an answer that I think is more germane to the equalities agenda than possibly to the human rights dimension of it. I mean, is this not something that a progress on tackling some human rights elements, for example, those that were highlighted by Windrush, is something that can be progressed and yet hasn't been, in a way that possibly a wide and interconnected equalities agenda can't be? Well, more difficult. Sorry,
Rebecca, do you want to come in, or shall I?
Happy for you to, David.
So I would say this is a leadership issue, because all of the points that you've raised, whether it's in relation to international treaty monitoring or acting on recommendations, sit with the government. We can do our best to hold them to account. And this brings me back to the work that we can do using our legal powers. So we can threaten judicial review proceedings, and we've under the Equality Act. And one of the things we would really like to do, if there was an opportunity to increase our powers, is to have powers to be able to action and take...
needs public policy to address them. You know, the Lammy Review, Angiolini, Wendy Williams. And do you think that there's anything in the view that a row brews up, the government is called to take action, that what they do is then set up an inquiry or a review fronted by somebody with great, you know, credibility and commanding great respect. And then when the report comes out, sometime after the row has obviously subsided, it just gets swept under the carpet, and that there's a rather nasty sense that these reviews, which are undertaken by excellent people in good faith, are used by the government as a way of avoiding taking action to redress really legitimate grievances.
If I respond in the first instance, sadly, I think that is the case, which is why I make the point about this being a leadership issue. I think in good faith, many of these reviews are undertaken. Many of the recommendations are very sound and not very... Interestingly, what we see in Scotland and Wales is perhaps a greater appreciation of long-term issues in smaller nations. And if some of those approaches were applied to Westminster, dare I say it, then I think some of those recommendations might well have been actioned.
Thank you. Baroness Ludford.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Sarah Ludford. I'm a Liberal Democrat here in the House of Lords, focused on a separate protected characteristic, including relevant to our inquiry, the Commission for Racial Equality. Do you think that each strand, which...
Quite keen to take a step back, because I think the situation acknowledged that progress had been made, but that it was set up to be a strategic organisation to take a strategic view across all of the protected characteristics and to address human rights. So that has resulted in us being enormously broad, having to take important strategic decisions about what to enforce. It had a budget of £19 million just for race issues. We have a budget of 17.1 million for all of the work that we're required to do. So by dint of our funding, by dint of the reduction in our scope, we have to be much more strategic. I do, however, believe that by taking an approach which looks at workplace, education, health, many of those other areas, and taking an intersectional approach, we are driving change. And actually, when I read the report from the CRE, I felt pleased that we were A, carrying on its good work, but B, making really good progress, albeit with limited...
Saying, and I think perhaps important to emphasise that we do, in the work that we do look across the protected characteristics. It's very much embedded in what we do. So we have expert protected characteristic leads, we have expert protected characteristic networks we work with. And one thing I might add to David's previous comment about the government's approach is very much encouraging the government to work, with the race stakeholders and listen. I think maybe just to add to David's answer, though, in terms of how we work across all the protected characteristics and with the human rights remit, it's helpful perhaps just to kind of give a couple of examples. And I know, Chair, that this is something that you've been very much involved with, but on the domestic abuse bill, that's an example of sort of intersectional work where we were coming to it, from the gender place, but very much in terms of looking at how that impacted on disabled women and on ethnic minority women who are a particular target for domestic abuse. And in doing so, we worked very hard in terms of our stakeholder relationships across specific NGO groups and specialist stakeholders and sectors. But we identified specific and overlapping needs. We were really successful in improving court protection for survivors. And we go on to the Lord's stage with a consensus around the government taking consultation with the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, but also on the need for better protection for migrants, which has been a really key part of our work on the bill and speaks to that intersectionality, which helps in the race space. And I think just one other example is our work on pay gaps. And obviously, for the last couple of years, we've been keen that whatever is done in the ethnicity pay gap place also looks at recruitment, retention, and progression. And we're able to offer that sort of cross-protected characteristic expertise and challenge and scrutiny.
Thank you. Lord Singh.
Chair, I think I've got...
Sorry.
I just wanted to come back because I had a question about whether you thought you had the necessary duties and powers and structures to be able to act as an effective enforcer for Black people's human rights. I mean, David was really saying that not only does he want more powers, but some have been cut. Could you elucidate on what's been cut and where you'd want not only restored but enlarged, as well as your budget, obviously?
Yeah, thank you. So, in relation to additional powers, we heard from the earlier witness in relation to public sector equality duty, one of your colleagues' questions. We think it's a really important power, but we would like it to be a more effective power so that targets could be set consistent with the line of questioning early on. And one of the reasons that we're bringing our Section 31 investigation against the Home Office for the hostile environment, which Rebecca mentioned, was to look forward to determine how we can make the public sector equality duty more effective. We'd like the power to fine in relation to, for example, gender pay gap, to bring claims. And that was something that was taken out of scope and removed from us and is now run by the government on an outsourced basis. But it's one of a number of things that the CRE was able to do in relation to people who were keen to seek redress that we cannot do any longer.
But can I just add to that David's absolutely right to identify the helpline as being something that we no longer have sufficiently close connection to have a sort of optimal position in terms of identifying data for us to take forward litigation. But we do a lot of strategic litigation in relation specifically to race work. And looking back over the last 5 years, almost 1 in 5 of the cases that we've taken either addressed wholly or partly address issues of race. And just to mention a few of them, we had a key case on adoption, which resulted in the government writing to every single director of children's services in the country, referring to our case. It's called Manders, and advising people not to turn down anybody on the basis of race or frankly any other protected characteristic. But I could also mention the right to rent case recently, our injunction that we won against the landlord Fergus Wilson, who was refusing to rent out properties to people from particular ethnic minorities. Our 2 cases that we took on people's right to wear their hair however they like, so both at work and in relation and at school, and a lot of work also that we've undertaken outside, particularly the court. So, for example, our inquiry into racial harassment at universities, which received really wide coverage last year and resulted in the minister saying that he wanted to scrutinise the Office for Students' powers in relation to that topic and writing to every single university in the country. Our submissions on the Grenfell inquiry, and I could keep going, but I think it's really important to say that we have lost powers. We would like them restored, and there are other powers, as David says, that I think would help us work even more effectively. But we are quite proud of our record in this space.
Lord Singh.
Good afternoon. I'm Lord Singh of Wimbledon, the crossbench peer in the House of Lords. So good afternoon to you both. I've just been learning to what extent your budget and your powers have been cut compared to the CRE. Now, what difference could it make if those powers were restored to some extent?
In relation to an increase in budget, to give you a specific example, we've launched our inquiry into race issues arising from COVID-19, and we're going to focus specifically on work. But had we more budget, then clearly we could look at more areas and the sort of things that have been identified as inequality of outcomes that really were coming up from earlier questions, whether it's in relation to education or the health sector. On the question of human rights powers, we only have the power to litigate and to intervene on the basis of equalities issues, although where the human rights aspects overlap, we can refer to those issues. So I think in relation to, let's take the example of care homes and some of the major issues in relation to the failure to use PPE, the right to life there, which the chair referred to right at the top of the meeting, is something that we do not have the power to action currently. So that is one of a number of areas where, had we wider powers, we, I think, would be able to make much more significant impact. But Rebecca, can I hand over to you for any other examples?
Willingly, thank you very much, David, and very much endorse what you just said. I suppose just a couple of other things I'd mention on a particular area. What we started to do was look at running legal support projects in very specific places to support priority objectives. So, for example, last year we ran one on transport, and that enabled us to take first instance cases to develop, as you say, to raise awareness among duty bearers that this was a regulated space, and that, in this instance, might help us to drive up more casework by working with race NGOs in the current climate. But that's the kind of thing where our resources really limit what we're able to do. And I'd mention one other thing where we've been starting to be very active, which is looking at regional disparities across England, identifying the gaps that I think we all want to address in what I think is generally called the building back agenda or the levelling up agenda, where we are very keen to work, particularly with the PSED, but other levers which are open to us, to help local authorities and devolved administrations to identify where measures can be taken to address some of those gaps, particularly, within the protected characteristics, and I think particularly in terms of race and gender and disability. But how much we can do in that space is limited by our resource, and the more we have, the more we can do.
Thank you. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm Dean Russell. I'm the Member of Parliament for Watford. Just a quick question. Forgive me if I've got this wrong, but am I correct in thinking that none of the commissioners on post? So in terms of the committee, from what I've seen, or the group as a whole, is primarily white. That's correct, yeah?
At commissioner level, we represent a wide range of protected characteristics, but in terms of ethnicity, a number of us represent different ethnic backgrounds. But in terms of skin colour, yes, predominantly white. That's not the case. That's not necessarily the case for our workforce.
No, I understand that. Is that something that, especially in light of the Black Lives Matters movement, though, is that something that I assume you're looking at to make sure that there's a proper representation at the very top?
It's probably worth clarifying that if it were in our gift, and it's certainly something as chair where I've made recommendations to the Secretary of State, we've been very keen to have a more diverse group of commissioners, but it's a strange creation of an arm's length body that we hold government to account. We are on one level independent, but we do not appoint our own commissioners, and we don't appoint our chief executive. So I think the answer would be, to the extent that we can influence outcomes, we have submitted to the Secretary of State names of people who are more diverse. Currently, that's not the case, but there is a recruitment process ongoing, and we would hope, and our request to the Secretary of State is that we are more genuinely representative at commissioner level of the protected characteristics that we seek to advance.
Thank you.
So do I take that to mean then that you think the government should appoint a black commissioner to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, because currently there is no black commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission?
Correct. Yes, we are.
Right.
That would be a correct assumption.
Chair, may I just ask then, David, can I just ask then, if you've written, especially in light of recent events, but generally, if you've written explicitly to the government to request that, am I correct in assuming that from what you've just said?
Well, there is, as I mentioned, a procurement process going on, and we have expressed a desire that we have a greater diversity amongst our commissioners, and that I'm not involved in the process, but I do believe that to have black representation has been a particular request made by the Government Equality Office and by my colleagues. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask one final question, which is not an issue that of your making, but I just would like your views on it, because Rebecca and you have both spoken about cross-departmental work and intersectionality, but it's the case, isn't it, that there's also the issue of identity and singular focus. And when people march in the streets, they don't actually march shouting for intersectionality. They call for Black lives to matter, or they call for women's rights to be respected. And isn't there something that's lost, not only in the loss of resources of having, instead by having one body which looks at everything with the danger that nothing is visible, and you've got justifiably a great deal of pride in your work, but it's impossible for people to see that being championed on their own behalf?
I think you're right, Chair. When people march in the streets, they are usually not marching for intersectional issues, although one of my reflections as Chair is that the underlying socioeconomic issues that impact upon all protected characteristics is something that we mustn't lose. And the point I wasn't able to make earlier on was about the implementation of Part 1 of the Equality Act, because I do think that is incredibly important. And I think COVID-19 shines a light on the socioeconomic issues of people with protected characteristics, whether they are old people, whether they are disabled people, or whether they're Black people. And so my view would be, I'd be anxious not to unravel the good work that EHRC has done in the last 4 years. I think there is a role for a strategic litigator and regulator. I do think that it would be better if we had more resources within the ambit of the EHRC adequately to deal with the kind of points that you're raising in relation to particular protected characteristics. So my point would be it could be done under the current umbrella without dismantling the EHRC. And so therefore it's about advocacy with all sorts of commissioners representing all sorts of protected characteristics with proper budgets. But Rebecca, I don't know whether you'd agree.
I do agree, and I think I would add to that to say I think David is rightly proud of the progress that the Commission has made under his leadership, and I don't think either he or I would say that the Commission achieved effectively and perfectly from day one. But I think over the last 4 years in particular, we've gone through 2 major change programmes, and they've both been anchored around the idea of identifying impact and ensuring that we use our theory of change to have evaluated and measured impact across what we do. And in that light, we have a very professional team. We have identified different functions across the organisation which are led to ensure that the compliance or enforcement or whatever is led to greatest effect, and that includes projects. But in that light, I do think that there is a real value in bringing people together. And when we talk to our strategic reference group across all protected characteristics, and in relation to very specific work that we do with our convening role hat on, it is about actually encouraging people to see where their common challenges lie. And while I think that you're absolutely right in identifying that need for people to think that somebody is standing up for me, it's also important that we bring people together and we don't become a more polarised and segregated society.
Thank you. Just can I go to the last question to Alf Dubs, please?
Yes, thank you. My name's Alf Dubs. I'm a member of the House of Lords. Look, we've talked a lot about the powers of the Commission, how they could be improved, how you could be given more resources and so on, which is fine. But what do you think needs to be done to ensure that the protection of black people's human rights is given greater priority by the government?
Well, if I start off and hand over to you, Rebecca, I think we need parliamentarians to continue to hold the government to account. We at the Commission and other NHRIs must play their role. For example, we had a meeting this morning with the NHRIs from Northern Ireland and Scotland, and I think we need to appeal to everybody who's been shocked by what has happened during COVID and the inequality of outcomes that COVID has revealed, which means...
And I think it was very interesting to see what COVID looks like in 50 years' time looking back. And I think, you know, there'll be loads of human rights textbooks written about what's happened this year in this country and across the world. But I think one of the things that we've seen happen is our mandate writ large in headlines in the newspapers every day. And we've also seen a real sort of underlining of the human rights principles, sadly often because they've actually failed to be followed. So the idea that interference with rights should be proportionate and measured, rooted in science and in law, the idea that we shouldn't have blanket applications of rules, but people should look at things on a sort of case-by-case basis, that we shouldn't fast-track new innovation, but we should be looking at evaluation and collection of data. All those things done properly protect the lives, black lives and other lives. And in many cases, we haven't seen it happen. And we hope, I think, that we can learn the lessons from that as a society, and that what's happened the past few months, and sadly probably the months to come, is going to provide a different narrative for human rights and how much they matter to communities across the country. And we hope that that will be something that leads to good, and that there is an opportunity here, I think, for people to understand better how they can help. And we've made a number of recommendations to different select committee inquiries, obviously including here across a whole range of issues that have come up in this particular space. And I'm not going to kind of bore you by going through all of them, but they range from, releasing people from that will draw attention to the issues and help people come together to look at them differently going forward.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our two witnesses. And that concludes our public evidence session in the context of this Black Lives Matter inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.